Christopher Columbus made 4 trips to the New World. On his first trip on October 27, 1492, he arrived at the north coast of the island of Cuba. He took possession of the island in the name of the Catholic monarchs of Spain and named it Juana in honor of the Spanish princess. Columbus fell in love with the beauty of the countryside, the bright sunlight, the intense green color of its vegetation, its contrasting turquoise of the sea. Impressed, he wrote in his diary, "This is the most beautiful land that human eyes have ever seen." Columbus called the inhabitants he found in Cuba Indians, thinking he had arrived in India. The island's native population was divided into 3 main groups: Guanahatabeyes, Siboneyes, and Taínos. The latter group was the most developed. They were excellent farmers and fishermen. They lived in small villages called bateys. Their houses were built from weaved palm tree leaves, similar to present-day bohíos. Each family had its piece of land called conuco, where they raised yams, corn, cotton, tobacco, and yucca-based cassava, which early settlers used as a bread substitute. The first 7 towns were founded during the Spanish conquest under Diego Velázquez's orders. Today, they are Cuba's oldest cities. Founded in 1512, Barracoa is known as the first city of Cuba. The eastern part of Cuba is famous not only for its beauty, but especially for its courage and bravery. The village of Bayamo was founded in 1513. Among the oldest cities in Cuba, Bayamo is possibly the one that breathes the greatest historical wealth. The battles for independence began to take hold in this city during the 19th century as an expression of incipient Cuban nationality. Bayamo was the birthplace of the father of the Cuban nation, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who started the 10 Years' War in October 1868. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes was the first person to free his slaves at the de Mahagua sugar mill. Another citizen of Bayamo, Pedro Figueredo, also known as Perucho, wrote the verses that would later become Cuba's national anthem. In Trinidad's mountains, also known as the Escambray Range, we find topes de collantes, a natural habitat rich in forest and abundant vegetation. The mariposa, the butterfly lily, is Cuba's national flower and is common here. Among the beautiful spots at Topes de Collantes, we find the Caburni River waterfall and Cuba's national bird, the tocororo, or trogon. For the first 300 years of its colonial life, Cuba remained a less important part of the Spanish Empire when compared with Mexico and Peru. Cuba had little mineral wealth, and Spaniards searching for gold and silver concentrated on the mainland colonies. Cuban society developed slowly, and the island was primarily a supply naval base for Spanish fleets transporting metals from Mexico and Peru. Several factors converged in the late 18th century to bring Cuba into world affairs and to give sugar a major boost. In 1762 and 63, the British occupied Cuba. Oppressive Spanish trade restrictions were lifted, and Cuba was thrown open to trade with England and its North American colonies. Following the occupation, Spain relaxed its restrictive trade policies and allowed Cubans to trade with its neighbors to the north. The occupation gave Cuba an initial economic impulse. With the slave uprising and the destruction of the sugar properties in neighboring Haiti in the 1790s, Cuba was ready to become the sugar bowl of the Caribbean and replace Haiti as a supplier of sugar to Europe. Thousands of slaves were imported to work the sugar plantations. Throughout the 19th century, sugar as well as coffee, tobacco, became increasingly important. Large cattle estates were subdivided. The Spanish crown also aided in the development of sugar. In 1795, Cuba had 478 sugar mills. By 1860, it is estimated that there were over 900 steam sugar mills, producing over 500,000 tons of sugar. A prosperous and influential class of rural proprietors emerged. This new aristocracy of wealth feared a repetition in Cuba of the events in Haiti. They supported the Spanish monarchy and sought the army's protection. Cuba's cultural life developed rapidly during the 19th century. Poets like Avellaneda and Heredia wrote about the beauty of the island, and musicians like Manuel Samuel and Ignacio Cervantes produced beautiful music. Cuba's nationalist conscience emerged at this time under the intellectual influence of Félix Varela, José Antonio Sacco, and José de la Luz y Caballero. Céspedes' call for independence in 1868 recorded him in history as the father of his nation. These men laid a solid foundation for Cuba's national identity. Although remaining on the Spanish fold, the ever-faithful island gradually grew away from the Spanish crown. The views of the Cuban criollos and the Spanish peninsulares clashed. Some slave-owning criollos wanted annexation to the U.S., but after the American Civil War and the end of slavery, that movement declined. Others advocated reforms within the Spanish Empire. When that movement went nowhere, those clamoring for violence and independence grew. One of the warriors that most valiantly fought for Cuba's freedom and shared the ideals of independence was Antonio Maceo, a mulatto born in Santiago de Cuba in 1845. He was the hero of the Mambises, as the Cubans fighting in the mountains against Spain were known. He and Máximo Gómez led the Cubans in the famous machete charges that helped undermine Spanish power. Yet the most important leader of Cuba's independence struggle was the poet José Marti. Don't leave me in the dark to die like a traitor. I am a good man, and as such, I will die facing the sun. José Marti. At age 16, he was arrested for his political ideals and sent to exile shortly thereafter. From that point forward, he devoted his life to his Cuban fatherland and to the concept he called Our America. He was a prolific writer and became the father of the modernist movement in poetry. He organized the 1895 War of Independence and succeeded in uniting war veterans to join the common cause for independence. Marti returned to Cuba to continue his fight for freedom, accompanied by Máximo Gómez. Yet several weeks later, on May 19, 1895, Marti died in combat in a place called Dos Rios. Cuba had lost one of its greatest and most universal sons, the father of Cuban nationality. He died as he wished, with his face to the sun. The protracted wars in Cuba, U.S. concern about its investments in the island, and U.S. strategic interest in the Caribbean and the developing Panama Canal brought the Americans into conflict with Spain. When the U.S. ship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor in 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The war was short, decisive, and popular. The U.S. occupied Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines and expelled Spain from its last possessions in the New World. The 3-year U.S. occupation produced numerous changes in Cuba. The economy was revived. The system of rural guards as well as the new Cuban army was created. Health and education received much attention. Yellow fever was eradicated primarily through the work of Cuban scientist Carlos J. Finlay, who discovered that mosquitoes transmitted the disease. The Americans established a public school system, reorganized judicial system, and helped draft the 1901 Cuban Constitution. The U.S. included in the Constitution the Platt Amendment, giving the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba, a serious setback to Cuba's nationalistic ideals. In 1902, the U.S. ended the occupation and Cuba launched into nationhood with fewer problems than most Latin American nations. Prosperity increased during the early years. Militarism seemed curtailed. Social tensions were not profound. Yet corruption, violence, and political irresponsibility grew. A second United States intervention and economic involvement weakened the growth of Cuban nationality and made Cuba more dependent on its northern neighbor. The 1930s saw a major attempt at revolution. Prompted by a cruel dictatorship, the economic hardships of the World Depression, the growing control of the economy by Spaniards and North Americans, and a series of international events that included the Soviet and Mexican revolutions and student revolts in Latin America. A group of Cubans led by students and intellectuals and supported by the military sought radical reforms and a profound transformation of Cuban society. The overthrow of the regime of Gerardo Machado in 1933 catapulted Ramón Grau San Martín, a University of Havana physiology professor, and a group of students into power. Grau issued a series of progressive measures that broke with Cuba's past, yet the short-lived revolution of 1933 failed. The rise of militarism, the opposition of the United States, and divisions among Cuban political elites and within the revolutionary ranks returned the island to less turbulent time. Fulgencio Batista, an obscure army sergeant, emerged as the leader of the military after overthrowing the U.S.-trained officers. The military became the arbiter of Cuban politics, first through de facto ruling, and finally with the election of Batista to the presidency in 1940. Batista collaborated with Grau in drafting the liberal Constitution of 1940, now without the Platt Amendment. The end of World War II and the end of this early Batista era brought to power the inheritors of the 1933 revolution. In the democratic election of 1944, Grau San Martín became president, and 4 years later, his ally, Carlos Prío Socarrás, was elected. An era of democratic governments, respect for human rights, and accelerated prosperity ensued. Some expected a continuation of the revolutionary measures of 1933. Political violence and corruption increased. Many saw these administrations, commonly known as auténticos, as having failed to live up to the ideals of the revolution. Some still supported the auténticos and hoped for new leadership that could correct the vices of the past. Others turned to a new group, the ortodoxos, led by the charismatic leader Eduardo Chivas, a popular elected senator. But Chivas committed suicide in 1951. A few conspired to take power by force. Batista staged the coup d'etat on March 10, 1952, and returned to power. This event had a profound effect. It led to doubts about the ability of Cubans to govern themselves. It began a brutal dictatorship that resulted in the polarization of Cuban society, civil war, the overthrow of the Batista dictatorship, the destruction of the military, and most other Cuban institutions, and the rise of Fidel Castro's long totalitarian rule. But despite the political crisis, Cuba's economic growth was remarkable. In Latin America, Cuba ranked 4th in meat consumption, 5th in milk, and 3rd in per capita food calories per day. In 1958, Cuba had over 1 million radios for a ratio of 1 set per every 6 persons, ranking 8th in the world ahead of France and Great Britain. Television came to Cuba in October of 1950, placing the island among the first countries in the world to enjoy this entertainment marvel. In 1958, Cuba had 23 TV stations and more than 400,000 TV sets for a per capita of one TV set for every 15 people. Cuba also enjoyed a cultural renaissance, producing world-renowned musicians like Ernesto Lecuona and Julián Orbón, and painters like Wilfredo Lam and René Portocarrero. Out with the old and in with the new, remarked Ernest Hemingway. January 1st, 1959. The toppling of Batista signaled the dawn of a new era. Power lay in the streets, and Fidel Castro and his rebels came down from the mountains to claim it. A magistrate named Manuel Urrutia was sworn in as the new Cuban president. The cabinet was pluralistic, comprised of figures of diverse political spectrum. The charismatic leader of the 26th of July movement, Fidel Castro, was appointed commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Castro quickly emerged as the most prominent political figure. On January 8th, a triumphant Fidel addressed a large gathering in the capital city of Havana. He concluded his speech by declaring that he had no political ambitions and promising elections. April 15th, 1959. Fidel Castro arrived in the United States. Before leaving Cuba, Castro told reporters that the trip would serve to strengthen the ties with the United States. I know, first of all, that people are saying that we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear. Castro hid his anti-Americanism and his plan to transform Cuban society into a totalitarian state. He defended what he called revolutionary justice. Time magazine reminded its readers that by the end of April 1959, 529 Cubans had been executed. Communist presence grew within the revolutionary ranks. By Christmas 1959, the country's moderate cabinet leaders had been forced out. President Urrutia was removed and replaced by a loyal communist. Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine Marxist that joined Castro in the mountains, became president of the National Bank. Fidel's brother Raúl began organizing a repressive security apparatus modeled on the East German Stasi and the Soviet KGB. As the revolution entered its second year, the old economic order was overturned by the confiscations of foreign as well as Cuban-owned businesses. In a very short time, Cuba became a Marxist society under the control of an all-powerful leader. The media, the education system, all of Cuba's institutions fell into the hands of Castro's government. On May 1st, 1960, a large crowd gathered at La Plaza de la Revolución for May Day festivities. Fidel Castro adamantly rejected the need for elections, affirming that the voice of the people had elected him and the revolutionary leaders. U.S.-Cuban relations deteriorated. Diplomatic relations were broken, and the Kennedy administration imposed an embargo on Cuba. The eventual shutdown of the press allowed Castro to launch an assault against his opposition, which produced an increase of political prisoners and massive migrations out of the island. In late 1960 and 1961, the U.S. organized and trained 1,200 Cubans for an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. The promised vital air cover from the United States over the Bay of Pigs never arrived. The 1,200 Cubans were left stranded. It was a tragic disaster. After the failed invasion, Castro proclaimed,
"Porque hay que decir que por encima de todo somos marxistas-leninistas."
What we can say above all is that we are Marxist-Leninists. He embarked on a program to create a new man along socialist ideas, emphasizing loyalty to the party and the leader, and anti-Americanism. Fearing Marxist indoctrination, many Cuban parents sought a way out for their children. Operation Pedro Pan, as in Peter Pan, sent thousands of unaccompanied children to the United States in the care of the Catholic Church. Many of these children never saw their parents again. Cuba became an ally of the Soviet Union, and by 1962, the Soviets introduced nuclear missiles into Cuba, bringing the world close to a nuclear holocaust. Castro announced that those wanting to leave could do so and he encouraged various migrations. 1960s Cuban exodus, 200,000 left for the U.S. He who does not have a mind to adapt to the idea of a revolution, he who doesn't have a heart that can adapt to the effort and the heroism of a revolution, we don't want them. We don't need them. 1965 Cuban Airlift, 300,000 Cubans left for the U.S. 1980, another 125,000 Cubans fled their homeland in the Mariel boat lift. Today, there are over 1.5 million Cubans in exile. For 4 decades, Cuba became a close and faithful ally of the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, with Soviet support, Cuba sent several 100,000 troops to Africa, intervened in Latin America, and supported revolutionary anti-U.S. groups in the region. Cuba also became an ally of Iran and Syria and an enemy of Israel. Che Guevara attempted to spark revolution in Africa and in Bolivia, where he was killed. During the Yom Kippur Arab War against Israel in 1973, Cuba sent troops to support Syria. In the 1970s, Cuban troops participated in the overthrow of the Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua. At the turn of the century, Castro faced some of the old problems that had plagued the revolution in the past, as well as new and critical challenges. The failure and collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe produced a major economic dislocation in Cuba and the beginning of the so-called special period, with growing shortages of food, electricity, and transportation. There was growing evidence of disillusionment within the Communist Party and Castro's exhortations. Absenteeism and youth apathy increased. A dissident movement began to develop, and a growing number of Cubans opposed the Castro regime. Castro was losing the battle to create a new generation devoted to anti-Americanism, the party, and the revolution. Despite 4 decades of education and indoctrination, the new so-called socialist land was nowhere to be found. The loss of this generation represents one of the greatest challenges for the continuity of the revolution. Castro remained anti-American and an ally of the most extreme regimes, including Iran. Despite U.S. overtures for normalization of relations, Castro continuously criticized the U.S. In 1996, at the time that the Clinton administration hoped for the U.S.-Cuban rapprochement, Castro ordered his MiGs to down 2 unarmed brothers to the rescue small planes in international waters, killing 3 Americans and 1 Cuban American. President Clinton responded by approving the Helms-Burton Law, which codified the U.S. embargo. Economically, the Castro regime was extremely weak. Persistent structural problems, low prices for Cuba's exports, low productivity, and corruption produced a new frenzy of planning and greater militarization of society. Castro rejected perestroika and glasnost and returned to the failed paths of the past, insisting Cubans should work harder, sacrifice more, and expect less. A new savior emerged to help Castro. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela provided petroleum, loans, and investments. Yet Cuba has progressed little. Venezuelan aid only helped Cuba muddle through the difficult times. In 2006, Castro fell ill and relinquished power. A quick and smooth succession to his brother, General Raul Castro, followed. Little changed. Repression continued. Militarization of the economy increased. Cubans continued to leave the island. Minor economic adjustments were implemented under Raul, but Cuba was not moving toward a market or even a Chinese type of economy. Today, Cuba, an ally of Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, continued economic problems. Cubans living in poverty, no freedom or human rights. Cuba remains a military dictatorship.